Ladies and gentlemen, today we reflect on one of the most intense and pivotal conflicts of the 20th century, the war in the Pacific. This brutal theater of World War II stretched across vast oceans and tropical islands, pitting the Allied forces, led by the United States, against the expansionist ambitions of Imperial Japan. It was a war defined by fierce battles, incredible sacrifices, and an ultimate victory that reshaped the world. The beginning of the conflict. The war in the Pacific officially began on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This act of aggression crippled American naval power and propelled the United States into World War II. In response, the U.S. and its allies declared war on Japan, setting the stage for a grueling and relentless conflict. Japan's early expansion. In the early stages of the war, Japan rapidly expanded across the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and numerous islands. Their military strategy was swift and brutal, inflicting heavy casualties and demonstrating their formidable power. However, the tide of war would soon turn. Turning the tide, the Battle of Midway. A decisive moment in the Pacific War came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Here, the U.S. Navy, through strategic intelligence and bravery, ambushed and destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's naval strength. This battle marked a turning point, shifting momentum in favor of the Allies. The strategy of island hopping. The U.S. and its allies adopted a military strategy called island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, they targeted key strategic locations, capturing them while bypassing others. Major battles at Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943, Iwo Jima, 1945, and Okinawa, 1945, were fought with extreme intensity, leading to heavy casualties on both sides. The brutality of the war. The war in the Pacific was characterized by ferocious combat, harsh environments, and immense suffering. Japanese forces were known for their fierce resistance and refusal to surrender, leading to kamikaze, suicide, attacks, deadly banzai charges, and brutal treatment of prisoners of war, such as in the Bataan Death March. Civilians also suffered greatly, particularly in the Philippines, China, and other occupied territories. The atomic bomb and Japan's surrender. As the war neared its end, Japan showed no signs of surrendering. To avoid a prolonged and deadly invasion, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. These bombings caused massive destruction and loss of life, leading Japan to surrender on August 15, 1945. The official surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, marking the end of World War II. The aftermath and lasting impact. The war in the Pacific reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Japan was occupied by the United States, undergoing significant political, economic, and social reforms. The war also set the stage for the Cold War as tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union escalated. Conclusion. The war in the Pacific was a conflict of immense scale and sacrifice. It tested the limits of human endurance and changed the course of history. As we remember those who fought and died, we must also reflect on the lessons learned, the horrors of war, the cost of aggression, and the enduring pursuit of peace. Let us honor the bravery of those who served and ensure that such a devastating conflict never happens again. The war in the Pacific began with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The war in the Pacific was officially ignited by a bold and devastating assault launched by the Empire of Japan on the United States. In the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers positioned themselves in the Pacific Ocean and unleashed a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the primary base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, located in Hawaii. The attack was meticulously planned to cripple American naval power, giving Japan free rein to expand its empire across the Pacific without immediate interference. At approximately 7:55 a.m., waves of Japanese bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter aircraft descended upon the unsuspecting American forces. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 American servicemen and civilians were killed, with thousands more wounded. The Japanese forces targeted battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft stationed at the base, inflicting catastrophic damage. Among the most infamous moments was the sinking of the USS Arizona, where over 1,100 sailors lost their lives as the ship exploded and sank. Other battleships, such as the USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS California, also suffered significant damage. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a tactical military strike, but also a profound psychological blow to the United States. Before this moment, the U.S. had remained neutral in World War II, despite growing tensions with Japan over its aggressive expansion in China and Southeast Asia. However, the devastation at Pearl Harbor changed everything. On December 8, 1941, just one day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, delivering his famous speech in which he called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. With overwhelming support, Congress declared war on Japan, officially bringing the United States into World War II. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was part of a larger, coordinated offensive to assert dominance in the Pacific. On the same day, Japanese forces launched invasions in the Philippines, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. This swift expansion demonstrated Japan's military prowess and determination to establish a powerful empire. However, despite the success of the attack, Japan failed to achieve its ultimate objective, destroying U.S. aircraft carriers, which were not present at Pearl Harbor that day. This miscalculation would prove critical in the months to come. While Pearl Harbor was a tactical victory for Japan, it ultimately set in motion a conflict that would lead to Japan's downfall. The attack galvanized the American people, uniting them behind the war effort with an unprecedented sense of purpose and resolve. The U.S. would now fully mobilize its industrial and military strength, preparing for a long and brutal campaign to reclaim the Pacific and defeat Japan. Japan rapidly expanded across the Pacific, capturing key territories like the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a rapid and highly coordinated campaign of expansion across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Their primary goal was to establish a vast empire by seizing resource-rich territories and eliminating any opposition before the Allies could mount a significant counterattack. Within months, Japan had achieved astonishing military successes, capturing key strategic locations and dealing severe blows to the Allied forces. One of Japan's first major targets was the Philippines, a U.S. territory and home to a significant American and Filipino military presence. On December 8, 1941, just hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched an invasion. The well-coordinated assault included airstrikes on Clark Air Base and other military installations, effectively crippling American air power in the region. By December 22nd, Japanese troops landed in Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, and began their relentless push towards the capital, Manila. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. and Filipino forces attempted to resist the Japanese advance, but were ultimately forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. After months of intense fighting, disease, and dwindling supplies, the defenders were overwhelmed. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell, followed by the surrender of Corregidor on May 6, 1942. What followed was one of the most infamous war crimes of the Pacific Theater, the Bataan Death March, where approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to march over 60 miles in brutal conditions, with thousands dying due to exhaustion, starvation, and executions by Japanese soldiers. At the same time, Japan launched an invasion of British-held Malaya, now Malaysia, on December 8, 1941. British defenses, led by General Arthur Percival, were unprepared for the speed and effectiveness of the Japanese military. Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita used innovative tactics, including rapid bicycle infantry assaults, which allowed them to move swiftly through dense jungles and bypass British defensive positions. By January 31st, 1942, Japanese forces had pushed the British troops back to Singapore, considered the Gibraltar of the East due to its strong fortifications. However, the British had underestimated Japan's ability to attack from the land, as they had focused their defenses toward a naval assault. On February 8, 1942, Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait and launched their assault on the island. After just 7 days of fighting, British forces surrendered on February 15, 1942, marking one of the worst defeats in British military history. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops became prisoners of war, many of whom faced brutal treatment in Japanese captivity. In addition to the Philippines and Malaya, Japan expanded its conquests across the Pacific. They captured Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Burma, Myanmar, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, in rapid succession. Each victory secured valuable natural resources such as oil, rubber, and metals, which were crucial for Japan's war effort. Their control over the Pacific seemed almost unstoppable, and by mid-1942, the Japanese empire stretched from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Despite these overwhelming victories, Japan's rapid expansion would also become a critical weakness. The vast territories they occupied required immense resources and manpower to defend, stretching their military thin. Additionally, their aggressive expansion provoked the United States, Britain, Australia, and China to intensify their war efforts, setting the stage for the turning points that would follow. The Battle of Midway, June 1942, was a turning point, dealing a significant blow to Japan's navy. By mid-1942, Japan had established dominance across the Pacific, capturing vast territories and forcing the Allies into a defensive position. However, the tides of war would soon shift dramatically with the Battle of Midway, a pivotal engagement that marked the first major defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy and changed the course of the Pacific War. This battle, fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, was a high-stakes confrontation between the United States and Japan, centering around the strategically vital Midway Atoll. Japan's plan and objectives. Following their overwhelming successes in the first 6 months of the war, Japan sought to deliver a decisive blow to the U.S. Navy that would force America to negotiate a peace settlement. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, devised an elaborate plan to lure the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap and destroy them. Midway Atoll, a small but strategically significant island located about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, was chosen as the target. The Japanese believed that by attacking and seizing Midway, they would provoke the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a desperate response, allowing Japan to ambush and annihilate the American carriers. Yamamoto's strategy relied on deception and superior numbers, as he dispatched a massive fleet consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, numerous battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. U.S. intelligence and counter-strategy. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, American intelligence had successfully broken the Japanese Naval Code, JIN 25, allowing U.S. commanders to anticipate the attack. Cryptanalysts at Station HYPO, led by Joseph Rockefort, intercepted and deciphered Japanese messages, confirming that Midway was the target of an impending assault. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, devised a plan to turn the ambush against the Japanese. Nimitz positioned his forces strategically, placing 3 American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, near Midway, hidden from enemy reconnaissance. This gave the U.S. a crucial advantage, allowing them to launch a surprise counterattack once the Japanese carriers were vulnerable. The battle begins, Japan's initial attack. On June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft launched an attack on Midway Island, bombing airfields and installations. However, they failed to completely destroy the island's defenses. as Japanese pilots returned to their carriers to rearm and prepare for a second strike. American aircraft had already begun their counteroffensive. The U.S. launched waves of aircraft, including dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, from both their carriers and Midway itself. Early American torpedo bomber attacks suffered catastrophic losses, as outdated aircraft and lack of fighter support led to the near-total annihilation of Torpedo, Squadron 8, VT-8, and other squadrons. Despite this, their sacrifice distracted the Japanese fleet, forcing enemy carriers to maneuver defensively. The devastating counterattack. At approximately 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet at the perfect moment, just as Japanese aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on the flight decks. Within minutes, American bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, inflicting catastrophic damage. The ships were engulfed in flames, rendering them inoperable. Only one Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained operational and launched a counterattack, severely damaging USS Yorktown. However, the Americans quickly retaliated, locating Hiryu and delivering fatal bomb strikes that led to its destruction. By the end of the day, all 4 of Japan's carriers had been sunk, along with hundreds of their most experienced pilots and crew. The aftermath and significance. The Battle of Midway was a decisive victory for the United States and a crushing defeat for Japan. The Japanese Navy lost 4 of its most powerful aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More importantly, Japan's most skilled pilots and crew members were lost, a blow from which their Navy would never fully recover. For the United States, the victory at Midway shifted the momentum of the war, allowing the Allies to go on the offensive. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence gathering, aircraft carriers, and strategic planning, marking the beginning of Japan's decline in the Pacific. The battle also boosted American morale, proving that Japan was not invincible and that victory in the Pacific was possible. For the United States, the victory at Midway shifted the momentum of the war, allowing the Allies to go on the offensive. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence gathering, aircraft carriers, and strategic planning, marking the beginning of Japan's decline in the Pacific. The battle also boosted American morale, proving that Japan was not invincible and that victory in the Pacific was possible. The brutality of the Pacific War, kamikaze attacks, jungle warfare, and war crimes. The Pacific War was one of the most brutal and unforgiving conflicts in modern history. Unlike the European front, where battles often took place in cities and open fields, the war in the Pacific was fought in dense jungles, volcanic islands, and vast oceans. The unforgiving terrain, extreme weather, and the fierce resistance of the Japanese military made every battle a grueling and bloody struggle. This brutality was intensified by Japan's use of kamikaze tactics, relentless jungle warfare, and widespread war crimes, which made the conflict particularly horrifying for those who fought in it. Kamikaze attacks, Japan's desperate suicide missions. As Japan began to lose ground in the Pacific, their military leadership sought desperate measures to slow the American advance. One of the most infamous tactics to emerge during this phase of the war was the kamikaze, divine wind, attack, a strategy in which Japanese pilots intentionally crashed their aircraft into Allied warships, sacrificing themselves in an attempt to inflict maximum damage. The first major kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, as American forces moved to liberate the Philippines. Special kamikaze squadrons, often composed of young and inexperienced pilots, were formed with the belief that their suicidal sacrifice would bring honor to Japan and protect the emperor. These pilots were given just enough fuel to reach their targets, ensuring that they could not return. They were often sent off with ceremonial rituals, letters to their families, and an expectation of death. Kamikaze attacks became even more frequent and deadly during the Battle of Okinawa, June 1945, where thousands of kamikaze aircraft were launched against the U.S. fleet. Over 300 Allied ships were damaged or sunk by kamikaze strikes, and thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. The sheer intensity of these attacks left a lasting psychological impact on American forces, as they faced an enemy that refused to surrender and was willing to die en masse rather than accept defeat. Jungle warfare, a nightmare of disease, ambushes, and harsh terrain. For American, British, and Australian troops, fighting in the Pacific was unlike anything they had encountered before. Unlike the open battlefields of Europe, where tanks and large infantry formations could maneuver freely, the Pacific theater was characterized by dense jungles, rugged mountains, swamps, and volcanic islands, creating some of the most inhospitable combat conditions imaginable. In the jungles of New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Burma, soldiers faced not only a fanatical enemy, but also relentless natural obstacles. The humid and rainy climate bred disease, exhaustion, and infections. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery were rampant, and soldiers were often weakened by sickness even before facing combat. Supplies were difficult to transport, and soldiers often fought for days without adequate food, water, or medical treatment. Japanese forces, trained in jungle warfare, excelled at camouflage, ambushes, and surprise night attacks. They built complex tunnel systems, concealed bunkers, and sniper nests, making every advance a deadly struggle. American and Allied troops often had to clear enemy positions one by one, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers. One of the most feared aspects of jungle warfare was the Banzai Charge, a desperate mass infantry assault in which Japanese soldiers, armed with rifles and bayonets, would rush enemy positions in suicidal waves. These charges were designed to overwhelm Allied forces through sheer aggression and fanaticism. Though often unsuccessful, they inflicted heavy casualties and psychological trauma on American soldiers, many of whom struggled to comprehend the enemy's willingness to die so readily. Japanese war crimes, the Bataan Death March, and POW atrocities. The brutality of the Pacific War extended beyond the battlefield. Japanese forces committed numerous war crimes against prisoners of war, POWs, and civilians, many of which remain among the darkest chapters of the conflict. One of the most infamous atrocities was the Bataan Death March, April 1942, which followed the fall of Bataan in the Philippines. After 75,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to Japanese forces, they were forcibly marched over 60 miles in the scorching heat, with little food or water. Along the way, thousands of POWs were beaten, shot, bayonet, or left to die from exhaustion. Those who fell behind were executed on the spot. An estimated 10,000 soldiers perished during the march, making it one of the worst war crimes of the Pacific theater. Japanese forces also had a notorious reputation for mistreating POWs. Unlike Western nations, which adhered to the Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners, Japan's military doctrine viewed surrender as dishonorable. As a result, captured Allied soldiers were subjected to brutal forced labor, starvation, torture, and executions. The most horrifying cases of Japanese war crimes occurred in prison camps such as Changi, Singapore, Sandakan, Borneo, and various locations in China and Burma. POWs were forced to work on massive infrastructure projects like the Burma-Thailand Death Railway, where tens of thousands perished due to disease, starvation, and physical abuse. Some prisoners were subjected to gruesome medical experiments by Unit 731, a secret Japanese biological warfare division that conducted tests on live subjects, including disease injections, vivisections, and exposure to extreme temperatures. Beyond mistreatment of POWs, the Japanese military committed massacres of civilians in occupied territories. In Nanking, China, 1937, Japanese forces carried out mass executions, rapes, and acts of extreme cruelty against Chinese civilians. Similar atrocities occurred in Manila, 1945, where tens of thousands of Filipino civilians were massacred in an orgy of violence as Japanese troops, facing defeat, turned their rage on the local population. The psychological toll of the Pacific War. The relentless violence, harsh conditions, and refusal of Japanese forces to surrender took an immense psychological toll on Allied soldiers. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress from the horrors they witnessed, particularly the fanaticism of Japanese troops, kamikaze attacks, and the suffering of POWs. For many American and Allied soldiers, the Pacific War was not just a struggle for territory, but a fight against an enemy they perceived as inhumanly ruthless. This perception fueled intense hatred, which in turn led to atrocities on both sides. Some U.S. soldiers refused to take prisoners, executing surrendering Japanese troops in retaliation for Japanese war crimes. The psychological scars of the war lingered for decades, shaping post-war relations between Japan and the Allied nations. Despite the horrors of the Pacific War, the Allies pressed forward with their island-hopping campaign, determined to bring Japan to its knees. However, the brutality of the conflict made it clear that an invasion of Japan's mainland would be unimaginably costly, leading American leaders to consider other means of ending the war. The recapture of the Philippines was a crucial milestone in the Pacific War. The liberation of the Philippines was one of the most significant and hard-fought campaigns of the Pacific War. After being conquered by Japan in 1942, the Philippines became a key stronghold in Japan's defensive perimeter. For the Allies, reclaiming the archipelago was critical not only for strategic reasons, but also for symbolic and moral purposes, particularly for General Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to flee the islands after their fall. The recapture of the Philippines took place in a series of bloody battles between late 1944 and mid-1945, culminating in some of the largest land, sea, and air engagements of the war. The fall of the Philippines, 1941 to 1942, and MacArthur's pledge. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it simultaneously targeted American forces in the Philippines. Within days, Japanese troops invaded the islands, overwhelming the ill-equipped and outnumbered U.S. and Filipino defenders. Despite fierce resistance, the situation became untenable, forcing General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, to evacuate to Australia in March 1942. Before leaving, he famously vowed, "I shall return." After MacArthur's departure, American and Filipino forces surrendered in April 1942, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March, in which thousands of prisoners were brutally forced to march for miles under the scorching sun, suffering from starvation, disease, and execution at the hands of the Japanese. For over 2 years, the Philippines remained under harsh Japanese occupation, during which civilians endured brutal atrocities, forced labor, and food shortages. However, Filipino resistance fighters, known as guerrillas, continued to wage an underground war, sabotaging Japanese forces and gathering intelligence in preparation for MacArthur's return. The American counteroffensive, Leyte Gulf, and the initial landings. By mid-1944, after a series of victories in the island-hopping campaign, the United States was ready to begin the long-awaited operation to retake the Philippines. The first major step in this campaign was the invasion of Leyte, an island in the central Philippines, which served as the gateway to the rest of the archipelago. On October 20th, 1944, MacArthur and his forces stormed the beaches of Leyte, marking the beginning of the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific at that time. As American troops fought their way inland, MacArthur waded ashore and, fulfilling his earlier promise, declared to the Filipino people, "I have returned." This moment was not only a personal triumph for MacArthur, but also a powerful morale boost for the Allies and the local population, who had suffered under Japanese rule. The landing at Leyte triggered the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23rd to 26th, 1944. This massive engagement involved over 300 warships and hundreds of aircraft, as the U.S. Navy clashed with the remnants of the Japanese fleet in a desperate struggle for control over the Philippines. During this battle, the Japanese launched their first large-scale kamikaze attacks, sinking and damaging multiple American ships. U.S. forces destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, several battleships, and hundreds of aircraft, effectively crippling Japan's naval power. Despite the intensity of the battle, the U.S. secured a decisive victory, ensuring that Japan could no longer threaten American operations in the Philippines. With the Japanese fleet neutralized, American and Filipino troops intensified their push inland, engaging in brutal jungle warfare as they fought against deeply entrenched Japanese defenders. The Battle of Manila, one of the bloodiest urban battles of World War II. While Leyte was being secured, U.S. forces launched assaults on other major islands, including Mindoro, Luzon, and the Visayas, culminating in the Battle of Manila, March 1945. Unlike the beach landings and jungle battles that characterized much of the Pacific War, Manila was one of the few large-scale urban battles of the conflict. The Japanese, realizing that they could not hold the city, turned Manila into a death trap, engaging in ruthless scorched earth tactics. They booby-trapped buildings, laid mines, and fortified key locations to slow the American advance. Thousands of civilians were massacred as Japanese troops burned neighborhoods, executed families, and committed widespread atrocities. The city was bombed and shelled extensively, reducing much of it to ruins. By the time Manila was liberated in March 1945, over 100,000 Filipino civilians had been killed, making it one of the worst atrocities of the war. Though the victory was a major milestone in the campaign, the scale of the devastation left deep scars on the Philippines and further reinforced the brutality of the war. The final battles and the destruction of Japanese resistance. After the fall of Manila, American and Filipino forces continued their advance across the remaining Japanese-held territories, encountering fanatical resistance. Some of the bloodiest battles took place in northern Luzon, Mindanao, and the Cordillera Mountains, where thousands of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, preferring to fight to the death rather than be captured. By mid-1945, the recapture of the Philippines was nearly complete, with only isolated pockets of Japanese troops remaining in the mountains and jungles. Many of these soldiers continued guerrilla warfare even after Japan's official surrender in August 1945, with some refusing to believe the war had ended. Significance of the Philippine Campaign. The liberation of the Philippines was one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. It marked the end of Japanese control over a key strategic region, allowed the Allies to establish critical bases for their final push toward Japan, and restored Philippine sovereignty after years of brutal occupation. However, the campaign came at a terrible cost. Over 250,000 Japanese troops were killed, along with 50,000 American and Filipino soldiers. The civilian death toll was staggering, particularly in Manila, where over 100,000 lives were lost. The Philippines was left in ruins, with its economy, cities, and infrastructure devastated by the war. Despite the enormous human and material cost, the recapture of the Philippines paved the way for the final battles of the Pacific War, bringing the Allies one step closer to Japan's homeland. However, as the conflict neared its climax, it became clear that Japan would not surrender easily, forcing American leaders to consider even more drastic measures to end the war. The Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were among the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. As the Pacific War entered its final stages in 1945, the United States faced two of the most brutal and costly battles of the entire conflict. The Battle of Iwo Jima, March 1945, and the Battle of Okinawa, June 1945. These two islands were among the last stepping stones before reaching mainland Japan, and their capture was essential for launching a potential invasion of Japan. However, the Japanese military was prepared to fight to the death, turning these battles into some of the most grueling and savage encounters of the war. The Battle of Iwo Jima, February 19th to March 26th, 1945. Strategic importance of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island just 750 miles from Japan, was an essential objective for the United States Army Air Forces. The island housed Japanese airfields that launched fighter interceptors against American bombers attacking Japan. By capturing Iwo Jima, the U.S. could use it as a base for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids over Japan, launch fighter escorts to protect bombing missions targeting Japanese cities, eliminate a key Japanese defensive position that threatened American air operations. The invasion begins on February 19, 1945, after days of intense naval and aerial bombardment. 70,000 U.S. Marines landed on the island, expecting to overwhelm the Japanese defenders. However, the 21,000 Japanese troops, under General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had fortified the island with underground bunkers, tunnels, and artillery emplacements, making it one of the most heavily defended locations in the Pacific. Unlike previous battles, the Japanese avoided direct beach defenses. Instead, they allowed the Americans to land unopposed at first, then unleashed a devastating barrage of artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire from concealed positions. The American forces were trapped on the volcanic beaches, struggling to move inland while facing constant enemy fire. The fight for Mount Suribachi. One of the most critical objectives of the battle was Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano that provided a strategic vantage point over the entire island. The Japanese had transformed it into a fortress, with tunnels and bunkers allowing them to move undetected and strike from hidden positions. After days of brutal combat, U.S. Marines fought their way to the summit and, on February 23, 1945, raised an American flag, an iconic moment captured in one of the most famous war photographs in history. However, while the flag raising symbolized victory, the battle was far from over. Japanese resistance continued for over a month, with fierce hand-to-hand combat, surprise attacks, and last-ditch banzai charges. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders had been killed. Only 216 were captured alive. The U.S. suffered nearly 7,000 killed and 20,000 wounded, making Iwo Jima one of the costliest battles of the war for American forces. The Battle of Okinawa, April 1 to June 22, 1945. Why Okinawa was vital. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, was just 350 miles from mainland Japan. Its capture was critical for several reasons. It would serve as a launching point for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. It could be used as a major airbase for bombing raids on Japan. Control of the island would help cut Japan off from its remaining supply routes in China and Southeast Asia. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. On April 1, 1945, 183,000 American troops landed on Okinawa in the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Unlike previous battles, the initial landings were met with little resistance, as Japanese forces had withdrawn inland to establish heavily fortified defensive positions in the mountains and caves. The battle quickly turned into one of the most ferocious and horrific struggles of the entire war, characterized by massive Japanese kamikaze attacks that sank or damaged over 300 Allied ships, prolonged trench warfare, and cave fighting, with U.S. troops having to clear out Japanese positions one by one. Monsoon rains and mud, which made movement nearly impossible and turned battlefields into nightmarish landscapes. Kamikaze attacks devastate the U.S. fleet. As American forces advanced on land, the Japanese launched their largest kamikaze campaign of the war. Over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft were sent to crash into American warships, causing catastrophic damage. The attacks sank over 30 U.S. ships and damaged hundreds more, killed or wounded over 12,000 American sailors, forced the U.S. Navy to retreat at times due to the relentless aerial assaults. The battle for Shuri Castle and the final Japanese stand. The most brutal fighting took place in the southern part of Okinawa, where Shuri Castle, the Japanese headquarters, became the centerpiece of their defensive strategy. Well-dug-in Japanese troops, heavy artillery, and underground bunkers made every American advance a bloody ordeal. After weeks of grinding combat, U.S. forces finally overran the Japanese defenses in late May 1945. However, the battle was far from over. The Japanese launched desperate counterattacks, including night raids and suicidal last stands, leading to some of the most horrific fighting of the war. Civilian suffering and mass suicides. One of the most tragic aspects of the battle was the suffering of Okinawan civilians. Trapped between the two warring armies, tens of thousands of innocent people were killed, many from starvation, artillery fire, or bombings. The Japanese military encouraged mass suicides, telling civilians that capture by the Americans would lead to torture and death. As a result, entire families jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. Thousands committed suicide using grenades and knives. Japanese soldiers killed civilians who tried to surrender, fearing they would give intelligence to the Americans. By the end of the battle, between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians had been killed, one of the highest civilian death tolls of the war. The cost of the battle and its impact. Okinawa was declared secure on June 22, 1945, after nearly 3 months of continuous combat. The cost was staggering. Over 12,500 Americans were killed, with another 50,000 wounded. More than 110,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, and only a few thousand surrendered. The island was left in ruins, with entire villages and cities wiped out. The lessons from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These two battles made it clear that an invasion of mainland Japan would be catastrophic. If Japan was willing to fight so fiercely for small islands, American commanders feared that an invasion of the home islands would result in millions of deaths on both sides. With Japan showing no willingness to surrender, the United States began considering a new, more devastating option to force an end to the war: the atomic bomb. The role of kamikaze attacks and Japan's desperate defense strategies. As the Pacific War neared its climax in 1944 and 1945, Japan's situation became increasingly desperate. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been crippled, key islands had fallen to the Allies, and American bombing raids were devastating Japan's cities. Faced with overwhelming military power and dwindling resources, Japan turned to extreme and suicidal tactics to slow the Allied advance. Most notably, the use of kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze, meaning divine wind, was a strategy in which Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships, sacrificing their lives in a final attempt to destroy the advancing U.S. fleet. These suicide attacks were part of a broader philosophy of self-sacrifice, deeply rooted in Japan's warrior traditions, which emphasized honor and death over surrender. Alongside kamikaze attacks, Japan also relied on other desperate defensive measures, including banzai charges, hidden underground fortresses, and civilian resistance. The origins of kamikaze warfare. By mid-1944, Japan had suffered devastating defeats at the battles of Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, leaving its once mighty navy severely weakened. With American forces advancing rapidly across the Pacific, Japanese leaders knew they could not defeat the U.S. in a conventional war. The idea of using suicidal attacks as a formal military strategy was first proposed by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who argued that a single, well-aimed plane crashing into an American warship could do more damage than dozens of conventional attacks. By sacrificing their lives, kamikaze pilots could sink or disable large U.S. aircraft carriers, battleships, and transports, which were crucial to the island-hopping campaign. Instill fear and chaos among American troops, potentially slowing down their advance. Demonstrate the Japanese spirit of self-sacrifice, reinforcing the idea that Japan would never surrender. The first organized kamikaze units were created in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and their impact was immediate. U.S. forces were shocked by the effectiveness and ferocity of these attacks. The execution of kamikaze missions. Kamikaze pilots, many of whom were young and inexperienced, underwent intense ideological training before being assigned their missions. They were taught that their sacrifice was a great honor, and many wrote farewell letters to their families before their final flights. The typical kamikaze aircraft was a heavily armed fighter or bomber, loaded with explosives, fuel, and occasionally torpedoes. Pilots would dive toward enemy ships at high speeds, aiming to strike vital areas like decks, gun turrets, or fuel storage compartments. Kamikaze attacks were particularly effective against aircraft carriers, which had large flight decks vulnerable to fires, destroyers and cruisers, which lacked heavy armor, troop and supply ships, where a single explosion could cause massive casualties. While some pilots volunteered willingly, others were pressured or forced into service. Many were teenagers with minimal flight training, making their missions even more tragic. Major kamikaze campaigns and their devastating impact. Kamikaze attacks peaked during the battles of Leyte Gulf, 1944, Iwo Jima, 1945, and Okinawa, 1945. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. The first large-scale kamikaze attacks were launched against the U.S. fleet at Leyte Gulf, where they sank several ships and severely damaged the USS St. Lo, marking the first time a kamikaze attack sank an American aircraft carrier. Despite heavy losses, the Japanese were encouraged by the results and expanded their kamikaze program. Battle of Iwo Jima, February, March 1945. During the Iwo Jima campaign, kamikaze pilots were deployed to defend Japanese positions, though their impact was smaller compared to other battles. However, Japan continued to refine its suicide attack strategies, preparing for an even greater assault during the battle for Okinawa. Battle of Okinawa, April, June 1945, the peak of kamikaze warfare. The Battle of Okinawa saw the largest and deadliest kamikaze attacks of the war. Over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft were launched against the U.S. Navy, causing catastrophic damage. Over 30 American ships were sunk. More than 300 ships were damaged. Over 12,000 American sailors were killed or wounded. One of the most devastating attacks occurred on April 6, 1945, when waves of kamikaze planes struck the USS Bunker Hill and USS Enterprise, causing massive explosions and fires. The USS Bunker Hill lost nearly 400 crew members, marking one of the worst single-day losses for the U.S. Navy. The super battleship Yamato's suicide mission. In one of Japan's final desperate acts, the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa. With no fuel for a return journey, its mission was simple: crash into the U.S. invasion fleet and cause as much damage as possible. On April 7, 1945, American aircraft intercepted Yamato before it could reach Okinawa, sinking it with massive airstrikes. The ship's destruction symbolized the end of Japan's ability to wage naval warfare. Other forms of Japanese suicide attacks. Beyond kamikaze planes, Japan also deployed other suicide attack strategies, including Kaiten, suicide submarines manned torpedoes that were piloted directly into enemy ships. Shinyo, suicide boats, explosive-filled speedboats that rammed into American vessels. Human mines. Japanese soldiers would strap explosives to themselves and dive under tanks or landing craft. The psychological and tactical effects of kamikaze warfare. Kamikaze attacks had a profound psychological impact on U.S. forces. American sailors and pilots were horrified by the idea of fighting an enemy willing to die so easily. The attacks created an environment of constant fear and tension, as kamikaze pilots could strike at any time. However, despite their brutality and effectiveness, kamikaze attacks ultimately failed to stop the U.S. advance. The Americans developed countermeasures, including improved anti-aircraft defenses with radar-guided guns, fighter patrols, combat air patrols, to intercept kamikaze planes before they reach their targets, stronger ship designs with better damage control systems. The role of kamikaze in Japan's defensive strategy. Kamikaze warfare was part of a broader Japanese strategy to make the war as costly as possible for the Allies. Japan's leaders hoped that, if enough U.S. ships were destroyed, America might consider a peace settlement instead of demanding unconditional surrender. A high American death toll would discourage an invasion of Japan. The spirit of the Japanese people would remain unbroken, even in defeat. However, as the war continued, it became clear that no amount of suicide attacks could stop the overwhelming power of the U.S. military. Kamikaze warfare, while terrifying and deadly, could not turn the tide of the war, but it set the stage for Japan's last-ditch efforts to resist surrender. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their devastating consequences. By mid-1945, the Pacific War had reached its final, most destructive phase. The Japanese military was on the brink of collapse, yet Japan's leadership refused to surrender. After years of brutal island-hopping campaigns, the United States faced a difficult choice: invade the Japanese mainland or use a new, unprecedented weapon, the atomic bomb, to force Japan's surrender. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945, remain two of the most controversial and devastating events in military history. They marked the first and only time nuclear weapons were used in war, instantly killing tens of thousands and leaving lasting consequences for Japan and the world. The context: why did the U.S. decide to use atomic bombs? After the capture of Okinawa in June 1945, the United States began preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. This invasion would have involved millions of U.S. troops landing on the Japanese home islands, fighting an enemy determined to defend its homeland at all costs. Military planners estimated that hundreds of thousands of American soldiers could die in the invasion. Millions of Japanese, both military personnel and civilians, would be killed. The war could drag on for another year or more, prolonging suffering on all sides. At the same time, the United States had successfully tested the first atomic bomb in July 1945 in New Mexico as part of the top-secret Manhattan Project. President Harry S. Truman faced a historic decision. Should the U.S. use the bomb to end the war quickly, or should they proceed with a conventional invasion? Truman and his advisors believed that the bomb could force Japan's immediate surrender, avoiding a costly invasion, demonstrate America's military dominance, particularly to the Soviet Union, justify the enormous expense of the Manhattan Project, which had cost nearly $2 billion. Despite warnings from some scientists and military officials about the moral and ethical consequences, Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. The bombing of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. The target, Hiroshima. Hiroshima, a city of about 350,000 people, was chosen as the first target because it was a major military and industrial hub producing war supplies. It had not been heavily bombed before, meaning the effects of the atomic bomb could be fully observed. It was a densely populated city, which would maximize the bomb's psychological impact on Japan's leaders. The attack. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian Island. At 8:15 a.m., the crew dropped an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima. Within seconds, a blinding flash lit up the sky, followed by a massive explosion equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The bomb instantly killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, mostly civilians, flattened nearly 5 square miles of the city, generated heat over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, vaporizing people near the blast center, produced a shockwave that shattered buildings and set fires throughout the city. Thousands of survivors, known as Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, suffered from horrific burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical supplies were completely inadequate to treat the wounded. Despite the devastation, Japan did not immediately surrender. The bombing of Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. The target, Nagasaki. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki, a city of about 263,000 people. This city was also a major military and industrial center, producing warships, munitions, and other military supplies. The attack. Originally, the U.S. planned to bomb Kokura, but due to heavy cloud cover, the bomber was forced to change course and head for Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the B-29 bomber boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped the second atomic bomb, Fat Man. This bomb was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima, with a yield of 21,000 tons of TNT. The effects were similar to Hiroshima. Instantly killed around 40,000 people, with the final death toll rising to over 70,000. Destroyed most of the city, although the hilly terrain somewhat reduced the damage compared to Hiroshima. Caused severe radiation sickness, leading to thousands more deaths in the following months. The aftermath and the human cost. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain some of the deadliest single events in human history. By the end of 1945, over 200,000 people had died, either from the initial blasts, burns, or radiation poisoning. Many more suffered lifelong illnesses and disabilities. Effects of radiation. Radiation exposure from the bombs caused severe burns and keloid scars that disfigured survivors. Leukemia and various cancers, which appeared years later. Birth defects and genetic mutations in the children of survivors. The psychological trauma was also profound. Many hibakusha faced social discrimination and were treated as outcasts, feared to be contagious or cursed. Why did Japan surrender? The atomic bombings combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, August 8, 1945, and its invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. The destruction of Japan's cities through months of firebombing raids. The realization that no military defense could stop further atomic attacks forced Emperor Hirohito and Japan's leadership to surrender on August 15, 1945. This was announced via radio, marking the first time the Japanese people had heard their emperor's voice. The long-term impact of the atomic bombings. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had far-reaching consequences, both immediate and long-term. End of World War II. The bombings directly led to Japan's unconditional surrender, bringing an end to the war. Beginning of the nuclear age. The world entered a new era of nuclear warfare, leading to the Cold War arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Debates on morality. The use of nuclear weapons remains one of the most debated topics in history, with some arguing it saved lives by preventing an invasion, while others believe it was unjustified and inhumane. Japan's pacifist constitution. In the aftermath of the war, Japan adopted Article 9 of its new constitution, renouncing war and forbidding the use of military force to settle international disputes. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki serves as a grim reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons, shaping global politics and warfare for decades to come. Japan's surrender and the end of the war in the Pacific. After nearly 4 years of brutal warfare, the Pacific War finally reached its dramatic conclusion in August 1945. Japan, once an empire stretching across much of East and Southeast Asia, now lay in ruins, its cities destroyed by firebombing, its military crippled, and its people suffering from starvation and economic collapse. Despite these devastating conditions, Japan's leadership had refused to surrender, believing they could still negotiate better terms or force the Allies into a settlement. However, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war, forced Japan to make a painful decision. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, officially signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, marked not only the end of World War II, but also the beginning of a new world order. The aftermath of the war would reshape Japan's government, its society, and its place in global politics for decades to come. The final months of the war. Japan's desperate situation. By the summer of 1945, Japan was in a state of collapse. The U.S. military had successfully carried out its island-hopping campaign, capturing key territories like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which placed American bombers within easy range of Japan's home islands. The relentless firebombing campaign had already destroyed more than 60 cities, including Tokyo, which lost over 100,000 people in a single night of bombing in March 1945. The Japanese economy was in shambles, with factories destroyed and food supplies running dangerously low. Despite these catastrophic losses, the Japanese military still controlled millions of troops in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Military leaders hoped to force the Allies into a negotiated settlement, rather than face unconditional surrender, which would likely result in the loss of the emperor's authority and the occupation of Japan. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the final blow. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima was bombed, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, a Japanese-held territory in China. This invasion shattered Japan's hopes of using the Soviet Union as a mediator for peace negotiations. The Soviet forces, numbering over 1.5 million troops, rapidly overran Japanese defenses, capturing Manchuria, northern Korea, and parts of Sakhalin Island within days. For Japan's leadership, the Soviet invasion was as alarming as the atomic bombings. They knew that if the Soviets continued their advance, Japan could face a communist occupation, similar to what happened in Eastern Europe. The fear of losing control over their homeland and being divided between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, like Germany, was a major factor in their decision to surrender. The decision to surrender. Internal conflict in Japan's leadership. Japan's government was deeply divided over whether to surrender. The Supreme War Council, known as the Big Six, included both military and civilian leaders. While some argued that Japan must fight to the last man, others, including Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, recognized that further resistance would lead to complete destruction. The major sticking point in surrender negotiations was the status of Emperor Hirohito. The Allies had demanded unconditional surrender, but Japan's leaders feared that this would mean the emperor would be removed, tried as a war criminal, or even executed. For many Japanese people, the emperor was seen as a living god, and losing him would mean the destruction of Japan's identity. After the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion, Hirohito himself stepped in and made the final decision to surrender. On August 14, 1945, he convened a meeting with his advisors and, in an extremely rare move, spoke directly to his government, stating that Japan must accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. His decision overruled the hardliners in the military, who still wanted to fight on. The radio broadcast, Japan's surrender announced to the world. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation in a historic radio broadcast, known as the Jewel Voice Broadcast. For many Japanese, this was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. In his speech, Hirohito announced that Japan would accept the Allied terms of surrender. The speech was carefully worded, avoiding the direct use of the word surrender. Instead, Hirohito said, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." The announcement shocked many Japanese citizens. Some refused to believe it was real. Others wept openly in the streets, realizing their country had lost the war. Still, a small group of military officers attempted a last-minute coup to prevent the surrender, but they failed. September 2, 1945, the official surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. Although Japan had announced its surrender on August 15th, the official signing of surrender documents took place on September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri, a U.S. Navy battleship. The ceremony was attended by representatives from the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, France, Australia, Canada, and other allied nations. Japan's delegation, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shimitsu and General Yoshijiro Yamizu, formally signed the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, presided over the ceremony. In his speech, MacArthur stated, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." With the signing of the surrender documents, World War II officially ended. The Pacific War, which had begun with Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had now concluded almost 4 years later with Japan's unconditional surrender. The immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender. After the war ended, Japan faced enormous challenges. Occupation by Allied forces. The U.S. occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, with General MacArthur overseeing its reconstruction. War crimes trials. Japanese leaders, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were arrested and put on trial for war crimes. Economic devastation. Japan's cities were in ruins, industries destroyed, and millions of people homeless. Demilitarization and political reform. Japan was forced to disband its military and adopt a new pacifist constitution. Social changes. The emperor was no longer considered a divine figure, and Japan transitioned into a democratic society under American guidance. Global impact of Japan's surrender. Japan's surrender had far-reaching effects on world history. End of World War II. The war that had claimed over 70 million lives finally came to an end. Beginning of the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, now the world's two superpowers, began competing for global influence. Decolonization of Asia. Former Japanese-occupied regions, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Indonesia, sought independence from colonial rule. The birth of modern Japan. Under U.S. supervision, Japan transformed into a peaceful, economic powerhouse with rapid industrialization in the following decades. The end of the Pacific War marked not just the fall of Japan's empire, but also the beginning of a new global order that would shape international politics for the rest of the 20th century. A war that reshaped the world. The war in the Pacific was one of the most brutal and transformative conflicts in history. It was a war fought across vast oceans and remote islands, marked by relentless battles, immense suffering, and unparalleled destruction. From a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the island-hopping campaigns, from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Japan's final surrender, every moment of the war carried deep consequences for both the nations involved and the generations that followed. But beyond the military victories and defeats, the war in the Pacific forever changed the world. It led to the collapse of Japan's imperial ambitions, the rise of the United States as a global superpower, and the beginning of a new era of peace and reconstruction in Asia. The war also taught humanity a painful lesson about the horrors of nuclear warfare, a lesson that continues to shape international relations to this day. As we look back on this chapter of history, we must remember the millions who lost their lives, the countless soldiers and civilians who endured unimaginable hardship, and the resilience of those who rebuilt their nations from the ashes. The war in the Pacific was not just a clash of empires. It was a test of human endurance, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to survive and create a better future. While the guns have long fallen silent, the echoes of this war still remind us of the importance of peace, diplomacy, and the need to prevent such conflicts from ever happening again.